Good evening. I don't know how often you have stayed in hotels in your lifetime. My dad traveled a good bit for work growing up, and so I would go with him sometimes. And so I've stayed in hotels more than I can count. And there's some nice things about hotels. The towels are there. The soap is there. I don't know, whatever you want. It's kind of there. If you forgot your toothbrush, it's kind of nice to have that right there. But if you ever watch a video of black light in a hotel room, it kind of ruins the whole thing for you. I don't know if you've had this experience. Just to see the actual cleanliness of the hotel room will make you say, like nothing else, there is no place like home. There is no place like where you can control the cleanliness of your environment. And you can clean up after messes have been made. There's no place like home. We started this thought a couple weeks ago and talked about how in the story of the Bible, there's no place like home. And we got there by talking about creation, how originally humans in the biblical story are created for blessing. They are blessed to bless. And Abraham is called, after humanity has forfeited that blessing, Abraham is called to be a conduit of God's blessing. Abraham is blessed to bless. And then we talked about how Abraham's family is called to be that bridge between God and humans, to be a priesthood between divinity and humanity. And God promises this family that he's going to build them a house. 2 Samuel 7, he's going to build a house for David one day, a family for David. But then that house comes crashing down. And they find themselves in exile. They find themselves away from home. And for the rest of the biblical story, even when they come back to their homeland, they're never truly, really at home again. They're in exile. And really, the whole biblical story is one of exile after Eden, after Adam and Eve are cast out of the garden, after they forfeit the blessing that they were made for. The rest of the story is about exile. It's about looking for something that's not there. And that brings us to the last thing that we talked about a couple weeks ago, and that is this king that was going to come. And the promise of Israel's prophets is that when this king comes, he's going to fix everything. He's going to put everything back to the way it was, to the state of blessing. And of course, that king is Jesus. And tonight, we're going to talk about 3 different things. I'll come right out and tell you, this is not the most profound sermon I've ever given by any stretch of the imagination. And I like to have one main idea that kind of unifies what we talk about. I really don't know if there is one tonight. So we're going to be in this together and see how this goes. But there are 3 things that this week, coming to think on them, they've come to mean something to me. And so I hope in sharing them, they can come to mean something to you. My plan, and Ken, there it goes, okay. I feel like I'm calling Ken out every time. It's never Ken's fault. It's always probably my fault or technology's fault, one or the other. So what we're going to do for our 3 thoughts tonight is choose a different hospitality brand and use their tagline as the main idea. So we're starting with this in honor of my dad because he is a huge Holiday Inn person. I've stayed in so many Holiday Inns across the country. I never want to see one ever again. But we're going to start with Holiday Inn. And this is their tagline. Their tagline is, "We are there so you can be too." We are there so you can be too. I take this thought to talk about the people of God, the family of God. That we are there, we are here, so you can be too. To me, this speaks of being blessed to bless, like Abraham was, and like we are. In other words, the blessings that we receive in Christ, every spiritual blessing according to Ephesians 1, the blessings that we receive are not just so we can have the good life, right? They're not just so that we can live and enjoy our lives. They're meant to be passed on to other people around us, to bless the people in our lives. And at least for me, when I think about that, it makes me feel pretty good about myself. Because I am the one who has the blessing now to share with the people around me. If we want to use this analogy, I am the doctor who has this cure to a disease that is ailing all of humanity. It makes me feel pretty special, especially because I'm never going to be a doctor. I'm never going to heal people physically. So that makes me feel special. But the thing about this story, the biblical story, is that the doctors also have this disease. It's not that they are totally cured of the disease. Maybe they've made some steps toward healing themselves of it or being healed of it. But they also have this disease. And this is true from the very beginning. In Deuteronomy 7, just as one example, God is talking to the people, or Moses is talking to the people, and he says, "The Lord your God has chosen you. You are the doctors, but you were the fewest of all peoples." So he hasn't chosen you because you were the greatest nation on earth. He's chosen you even though you were the fewest of all the peoples. But it is because the Lord loves you and is keeping the oath that he swore to your fathers. That is humbling. If we take the choosing of God's people in this ancient text and say that something about how God chooses his people here says something about how he chooses us, I think it humbles us. It says that God can use me, even as infected as I am, to bless the people around me, the people in my life. I learned something this week that I didn't know about the bad guys of the Bible, and that is that almost all of them are related to the Israelites. Almost all of them are brothers of the Israelite people. If you go down the list, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Ammonites, the Shemites, the Edomites, the Moabites, they're all related through Noah's sons. They all trace back to those three sons of Noah. So what we read about, the conflicts that we read all throughout the Old Testament, are actually, this makes a lot of sense to me, family drama. It makes a lot of sense to me because family is complicated, right? Family's tough. And what we're reading in the Bible is that it's been tough from the very beginning. If you think about Cain and Abel, how Cain murders his own brother in the very beginning of the story. And then, as we trace through all of these conflicts in the Old Testament, they're just repetitions of that original conflict, the sibling rivalry between the two. They're the story of humans in the same family who can't live in unity together. And the question for me is, why does God stick with this one family? Why does God stick with the family of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and so on down the line? Because when you read the Old Testament, it's not working from a human, like practical, American, industrialistic perspective. They're not doing well. Like if you read through them, like we talked about a couple weeks ago, they're not morally upstanding people all of the time, at the very least. The Bible kind of goes out of its way to point out negative things about their stories, to point out these huge flaws in their character. So when we read through the story of God's people being chosen, it's not that the chosen people are good and righteous and the not chosen people are evil and wicked. It's actually that the chosen people are sometimes good and sometimes bad, and pretty much all of the time they're both, a complicated mixture of both. And the same is also true of the non-chosen people. There are non-Israelite heroes all throughout the Old Testament. I think of Rahab. I think of Ruth. I think of Jael in the book of Judges. I think of Jethro and Caleb. And David himself is a direct descendant of Ruth and Caleb, which means that Jesus is as well, right? So tracing, there are more that we can name, but tracing even those through the Old Testament story, the non-chosen, non-Israelites are oftentimes heroes. In other words, this is not a story where the good guys are over here and the bad guys are over here, and they're chosen and they're not. That's not why God picked Abraham and his family. He didn't pick them because they were the greatest of all the peoples. He didn't pick them because they were good. He picked them because he is good, because he wanted to bless the world, and he's choosing a family to commit himself to through them to bless the rest of the world. So, as I think about my life, I think we can take away from this that this story that we are invited to exist within, to make our story, is not a story where me and my people are good and everyone else is bad. It's not a story where people who have my same blood in their veins are good and everyone else is bad. It's not a story where my religion or my political party or my club or my school or whatever it is, where we are good and everyone else is bad. Of course, there's right and wrong in the world. There are levels of goodness that we seek to achieve. But saying that I am good and someone else is bad, I don't know if we oftentimes go to that extent, right? Like most of the time we're not going to say something like that. But at least for me, it can be my default setting. It can be my default setting to kind of subconsciously assume that I am in the right, that I'm right, that I am good, and that someone else who disagrees with me or is different from me is not. And I think, historically speaking, this is a trap that God's people fell into. The Israelites often came to define themselves against their enemies, against the non-chosen. They said that we are God's chosen people and you are not. We have Abraham's blood and you don't. And Jesus comes onto the scene and he turns that on its head. And just one example of many we could choose, Matthew 12, 46 through 50. While he was still speaking to the people, behold, his mother and his brothers stood outside, asking to speak to him. But he replied to the man who told him, "Who is my mother and who are my brothers?" And stretching out his hand toward his disciples, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother." So a normal person would say in this scenario, "Oh, my family's outside. Great, thank you for telling me. Just give me a few minutes. I'm in the middle of something. I'll go out and meet them in a minute." That's what a normal person would say. But in all the best ways, and sometimes confusing ways, Jesus is not exactly normal, right? Jesus is a little different sometimes. Actually, when Mark tells his version of this story in his gospel, he says that Jesus' family thought that he was out of his mind. They thought he'd gone crazy because he chooses this moment to almost speak in riddles, right? Your family's outside. It's a pretty normal thing to say. And he's here with his disciples, and he says, "These are my mother, and these are my brothers." It's almost like, if I just look at Sam down here on the front row, and I'm like, "This is my mother." Well, no, Sam is not my mother, but that's what he's doing here, right? He's taking his disciples, who are the same roughly age and gender as him, certainly not his biological mother, and he's saying, "These are my brothers and my mothers." It's a little bit different, but it's intentional, right? It's meant to jar us out. And that's one reason why I try to take it into our context, because we've heard this text before probably, so it doesn't jar us. But when we hear texts like this, when we hear texts like where Jesus says, "Hate your father, hate your mother, follow after me," that should shake us up. That should wake us up to say that there's something drastic that he's calling us to. Like even in our mobile and individualistic and autonomous America, we can still feel the sting of what Jesus says here. We can still feel the sting of "hate your father, hate your mother, and follow after me." I want to read you this quote from N.T. Wright, who is a Bible scholar and knows a whole lot more about the historical context of the New Testament than I ever will in my life. So it's kind of a long quote, and maybe there are parts of it that take a moment to grasp. But I wanted to read it to you to get the perspective of this man who lives in our time, but really has spent most of his life studying Jesus' time, to see maybe the drasticness of what Jesus says here. Like I said, it's 3 slides, so it's a little long, but let's see if we can grasp it. In a peasant society where familial relations provided one's basic identity, it was shocking in the extreme, what Jesus says here. In other words, just to unpack that, your basic identity, if you live in this time and place, is determined by, we would say, your last name. It's determined by your bloodline. In first century Jewish culture, for which the sense of familial and racial loyalty was a basic symbol of the prevailing worldview, it cannot but have been devastating. Jesus was proposing to treat his followers as a surrogate family. This had a substantial positive result. Jesus intended his followers to inherit all of the closeness and mutual obligations that belonged with family membership in that close-knit, family-based society. It also carried fairly clear negative consequences in that society. To be a member of one family meant setting loose to membership in the other. Now, before we finish reading this, get what he's saying here in the last 2 slides, just at least one point. He said that the basic identity for these people was their family. Then he says, in order to become a part of Jesus' family, they would have to give up that identity. Well, whatever it is that makes you who you are, if we're putting this into our time, whatever that is, take it away. That's what he's asking them to engage in. He's asking them to give up who they are, to, as he says, take up their cross and follow him, to become his family, to take up a new family of people that they haven't known their whole lives, people they're not related to, people they don't look like. He's asking them to take up a new identity and family. Hence the remarkable demands for Jesus' followers to hate father, mother, siblings, spouse, and children, and even their own selves. This was not just extraordinarily challenging at a personal level. It was deeply subversive at a social, cultural, religious, and political level. And just as a kind of a side note, I think in our culture, we're seeing the ramifications of this, where our culture, relatively speaking, is incredibly individualistic, meaning that I don't live in the same state as any of my family members, right? I live in Arkansas. I moved out from Alabama, from my homeland, and came here. Something like that would have been incredibly uncommon in this time and place because their identity was wrapped up in their family. So as Jesus' followers have taken over the world, if we can put it like that, as it's become the most popular religious movement in our world, we're seeing that in how it's impacted our culture, that we can choose to be individuals who sign up for life with other people who aren't related to us. It's Jesus' teachings in action. Now, big picture in this text, Jesus is untethering the family of God, being a part of the family of God, from being a part of Israel's physical lineage, right? He's separating those two concepts. He says that to be a part of God's family is bigger than just having Abraham's blood in your veins. And you can see that truth reflected throughout the Gospels in a similar way to the Old Testament, where in the Gospels, non-Israelites are heroes over and over and over again. There's the woman at the well. There's a centurion with great faith that Jesus says he hasn't even seen the equivalent of it in all of Israel. There's the centurion at Jesus' death where it cries out, surely this man was the Son of God. There's the Good Samaritan. There's a Syrophoenician woman. We could keep going. But over and over again in the Gospels, non-Israelites are depicted as the heroes. And that's intentional on the gospel writer's part. It's to say that this is why Jesus has come. This is what his kingdom is about. It's about not being tied to your physical bloodline, but to something different. And for us, we're not necessarily always tied to our physical bloodline, but it's to say that whatever tribe you find yourselves identifying with, speaking to us, whatever tribe we find ourselves identifying with in our modern world, Jesus' kingdom is about more than that. And when he's talking about it in Luke 13, he's talking about the fulfillment of it, the consummation of the kingdom, where his kingdom truly is on earth as it is in heaven and vice versa, where everything is put right to what it always has been. Right now we're getting a taste of that. But he says in Luke 13:29 that people will come from east and west and from north and south and recline at table in the kingdom of God. So around this table, this intimate setting of fellowship, all kinds of people from all over the world are coming together to this one place. The problem for us is it's easy for us to get in the way of that. And it always has been for God's people. I think this is one of the main points of the book of Jonah, is that God's mission in the book, if you're familiar with it, is to the nations, right? His mission is to the non-Israelites. But who gets in the way of that except Jonah himself, representing the covenant people of God? The one who is blessed to bless stands in the way of other people receiving the blessing. That's what happens over and over again in my story, where I get in my head, and in an interaction where I could bless someone, I end up just trying to impress them with how great I am, or I just try to get out of it, or whatever it is, where I get in the way of sharing God's blessings with the people around me. But what we're called to do is, like Jesus says in Matthew 28:19, the Great Commission, to go and make disciples of all nations, of all nations. You know, it's not easy to allow outsiders to be included. And really, if we want to take this a step farther and do, I think, what Jesus does, it's not easy to allow outsiders to define what it means to be included. Not just to welcome people in, but to allow people that we welcome in to redefine what it means to be inside in the first place. That's what Jesus does, right? As John is looking back on Jesus' life, as he's introducing us to this man that we know as Jesus, he tells us in John 1, he came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor the will of flesh, nor the will of man, but of God. He redefines one's basic community and identity. He redefines what it means to be me. He takes me into his family, into his kingdom. So, like Holiday Inn, we are here so everyone else can be too. We are blessed to bless. Second, like Motel 6. It leaves the light on for you. Hopefully like Motel 6, but cleaner, because that is a very low bar. Motel 6 is famous for this slogan, and it reminds me of this text in Exodus. No one could see anyone else or move about for 3 days. Yet all the Israelites had light in the places where they lived. This image is so powerful to me. It's in the middle of the plague of darkness. So darkness is covering the land, but the houses of the Israelites have light. Now, you don't need me to tell you that our world is dark, right? There's just so much violence and hatred and hunger and thirst and death and pain. Here in our society, we feel it, but historically speaking, and even in our own time, we are insulated from a lot of it. Because of how the physical and financial blessings, if we can put it that way, of our culture, a lot of us have the ability and have chosen the route of insulating ourselves from feeling the pain of the world. Middle-class America, I guess if we can put it like this, we can choose in some ways to live in a way that maximizes our comfort, right? I can choose the foods that I eat. I can choose the places I go. And sometimes I can choose my schedule. Generally speaking, default setting for a lot of us, the expectation is that I can choose to live in a way that makes me the most comfortable. But there's some times in life when we're woken up, right? There's some times in life where we realize that even the smallest of things throws us off, and we realize how fragile we really are, how the darkness that is in our world can creep in at any moment. And for this text, I want us to turn to it. It's Isaiah chapter 60, so it's not going to be on the screen. It's kind of a longer text, so I wanted to read it together. So if you have your Bible, go ahead and open with me to Isaiah 60. We'll be there in a minute. But we're about to read this text in the context, it's about exile. It's in the context of exile, where God's people have found themselves in this place where they've abandoned or been abandoned from their homeland, and they find themselves in this foreign country where they no longer have choices, where they've given up their freedoms. Isaiah 60, and we're going to read verses 1 through 7. This is a poem. It says, "Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you." Now, keep in mind, this is not true in this moment. This is a dark moment in their history. But Isaiah is speaking prophetically. He's speaking of the future. He says, "For behold, darkness shall cover the earth, and thick darkness the peoples. But the Lord will arise upon you, and his glory will be seen upon you. And nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your rising. Lift up your eyes all around, and see, they all gather together, they come to you. Your sons shall come from afar, and your daughters shall be carried on the hip. Then you shall see and be radiant. Your heart shall thrill and exult, because the abundance of the sea shall be turned to you. The wealth of the nations shall come to you. A multitude of camels shall cover you, the young camels of Midian and Ephah, all those from Sheba shall come. They shall bring gold and frankincense, and shall bring good news, the praises of the Lord. All the flocks of Kedar shall be gathered to you. The rams of Nebaioth shall minister to you. They shall come up with acceptance on my altar, and I will beautify my beautiful house." So this whole poem is about the reunification of Abraham's family. The family that's been divided, the family that's fractured, the family that's been fighting with itself from the very beginning is fixed here in this vision. So in this context of darkness, in this context where they have lost what's important to them, Isaiah has this hope for a reunification. He has this hope that he talks about, that the light of the Lord will rise like the rising sun and shine light on the darkness and brokenness of their world and unite this fractured family. And if we can put it like this is our welcome to the story of Jesus. This is our introduction to what Jesus is coming to do, to bring unity to his fractured human family. In Matthew chapter 5, verses 14 through 16, we have this famous text. And I think after having read Isaiah 60, you'll see some similarities from there to here. Jesus says, "You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. One thing that I think I emphasize a pretty good bit is that we are not blessed to look down on other people, right? We are not in the light so we can look down on people who are not in the light. So that's one side of a balance that we need to strike, where the other side of it is that we are called to be holy, right? We are called to be the light of the world. We're called to be different. We have God's Spirit living in us. We have a Spirit enlivening our spiritual selves that people who don't have that Spirit don't have. So we have to be aware that we're not better than anyone else. But we also have to lean into the reality that we are called to act better, right? We're called to live as though God really does live in us, to shine a light into the dark places of our world. In Philippians 2, Paul has a similar thought when he says that we are to do all things without grumbling or disputing, that we can be blameless and innocent, children of God, without blemish, in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. That's a high calling, because the disease that is infecting the entire human race, the human condition, as Dennis likes to say, is also at work in me, right? That darkness is at work in me, but I'm still called to be a light. I'm still called to shine in the midst of a dark world. In 1 Peter chapter 2, Peter picks up this theme of the priesthood from the Old Testament, among other things. And he says that you are a chosen race, picking up on that theme. A royal priesthood, picking up on that theme. A holy nation, same, another theme. A people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Remember that we talked about how the people of Israel, this is in many ways a reference to Exodus 19, 4-6, or quotation from that we read, how they were a nation of priests. And the function of a priest is to unite the divine and the human, God and humanity, to be a go-between, a bridge between the two. That's what they were called to be. That's what we are called to be. We're called to be a light, to shine God's light out into the world, to proclaim that the excellencies of him who called us out of darkness into his marvelous light, to let that light shine through us to the dark places of our world. Last thought for tonight. We started with Holiday Inn, we got to Motel 6, and we're ending with Airbnb. Airbnb's slogan is belong anywhere. Belong anywhere. Now, I didn't do this, but if you want, you can take a line and just put it right through belong anywhere, because that's what we're talking about. The point is that unlike Airbnb, God's people don't belong anywhere. This is talking about exile, and we won't talk about it for a very long time, but it will wrap up our thoughts for tonight. This is a quote from Walker Percy in his book, Lost in the Cosmos, the last self-help book. He says, the fundamental mystery of our universe is why we feel so alone and alienated from our own bodies, from our communities, from our families, and from the universe. This is supposed to be our home. So why is it so unstable? I think he's putting his finger there on an experience that we all share to one extent or another. And that is that at least deep down inside of us, in our very darkest moments, we feel that something is off. We feel that we don't belong in our family, in our friend group, in our school, at our job, in our church, whatever it is. We feel like, even when it looks like it should be the perfect place for us, we feel at least the slightest disconnect, right? Even I'm told, by people who know a lot more about marriage than I do, even the best marriages that people ever experience, there's always stuff you have to work throughout your entire life, right? There's always something, because there's something that disconnects us from each other. There's an experience of exile that we all live in. Jesus' followers understand this feeling deep down inside. In 1 Peter 1, Peter introduces his letter by saying that he is writing to those who are elect exiles. To those who are elect exiles. Now remember that Peter is not writing to exiles. He's writing to people who are going to bed or going to sleep in their own beds at night, right? He's not even writing to the Jewish people, mainly, people whose people had historically experienced exile. He's writing mainly to Gentiles, people who have not experienced exile. They are not exiles. But he says that you are elect exiles. And it's because, I think, these people understand this feeling that we should belong here, but something is off. This feeling that Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 2 through 4. And this will be our last text for tonight. But he says, "For in this tent we groan," this body we groan, "longing to put on our heavenly dwelling, if indeed by putting it on we may not be found naked. For while we are still in this tent, we groan, being burdened. Not that we would be unclothed, but that we would be further clothed, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life." This is a feeling that everyone feels, that the world that I'm experiencing right now doesn't have to define who I am or where I'm going or what I'm all about, that there's something here that is not our home. As we sing sometimes, this world is not my home. This is an amazing quote from C.S. Lewis, so I wanted to end with it, and because I think it'll get you thinking probably. It gives me thinking every time I read it. He says, "I am trying to rip open the inconsolable secret in each one of you, the secret which hurts so much that you take your revenge on it by calling it names like nostalgia. The secret we cannot hide and cannot tell, though we desire to do both. We cannot tell it because it is a desire for something that never actually appeared in our experience. We cannot hide it because our experience is constantly suggesting it." He goes on to say, "Beauty, the memory of our own past, are good images of what we really desire, but if they are mistaken for the thing itself, they turn into dumb idols, breaking the hearts of their worshippers. For they are not the thing itself, they are only the scent of a flower we have not yet found, the echo of a tune we have not heard, news from a country we have never yet visited." What he's saying is that the good that we experience in this life is just an echo of something that we know we've heard before, except we haven't. It's a scent from a flower that when I watch a great movie or something that connects me to life in a way that's deep and profound, when I have that experience, when I feel that feeling, I'm smelling the scent of a flower that I've never smelled. I'm getting a taste of a food that I've never eaten before because it's something like nostalgia, like he says. It's something that we all have deep down inside of us, a secret that we cannot hide and we also cannot tell. But it's there. And it bubbles over sometimes in ways that are really harmful to the people around us because it bubbles over in anger, in apathy, in depression, in anxiety, in laziness, whatever it does. It's an inner longing for the scent of a flower that we have never smelt. It's a longing for the heavenly dwelling that Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians 5. If we can put it like this to wrap up our thoughts back where we began them in the Garden of Eden, it's a longing for a home that we once had as a human race, and we've been missing ever since. It's a longing for the garden where we dwell as one with each other and with God, where we exist as one. I think that is what we're missing. And what do I know? Not much, but maybe that speaks to your experience as well. That the biblical story reaches into that part of our souls, that part of our souls that says that no matter the good that we do experience in this world, it's never enough because it's just a hint of a land that we've never been to, but we were made to exist within, and that one day we'll get to when our exile is over and our King comes and makes everything right. If you're not walking with him, if you're not experiencing the taste of his good world, tonight is the night to begin it. And won't you do it as we stand and sing together?